So I'm really pleased to have author Bo Jacobs here with us today. Also, it is uh, I think the 10th year of our coalition. So founded in 2026, it's now, or sorry, in 2016, it's now 2026. So Happy New Year to folks. I know there's a lot going on in the world, but Bo, we're really grateful you're here and willing to share some of your wisdom with us. And we'll go ahead and give you the floor.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Sean, and thank you folks for making it for finding us over here. And it's my pleasure to be here. I'm really glad to be here. Um, I'll talk real quickly. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of my work that specifically in ways that it relates to nuclear weaponry. Um, I'm a historian of science and technology. I study nuclear technology, history of nuclear technologies. I worked for 19 and a half years at the Hiroshima Peace Institute at Hiroshima City University. And during that period, we opened a graduate school of peace studies at Hiroshima City University. I'm professor emeritus there and just returned to the US and live in Portland, Oregon. I've had Portland isn't a place I've lived before, but I've had a long involvement in Hanford activism, specifically with the core group, consequences of radiation exposure. So I want to talk a little bit about certain aspects of how nuclear weapons are understood by nuclear weapon states and how people have been harmed by them. So I'll move on to my presentation file. All right. So folks can see that, correct? Okay, great. So again, I'm an emeritus professor at HPI at the Peace Institute, and I'm currently also a visiting professorial fellow at the University of New South Wales in Australia, not in residence. I'm here in Portland. This research is based on my most recent book, which came out in 2022, called Nuclear Bodies: The Global Hibakusha. This talk that I'll give, this short talk today, is based on primarily on one of the chapters of that book. Um, and so I'll just get into it here. I know some of you may know some of this, but we'll take a little walk through this. You may know the word hibakusha. Hibakusha is the Japanese word to describe the survivors of the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Um, people who people who lost family members almost certainly may have come close to losing their own lives. People who may have encountered radiogenic illnesses and went through the horror of the nuclear attacks in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki. These are the only people in the world who have been directly attacked by nuclear weapons. However, there are millions of people who have been affected and had their health affected by nuclear weapons. And these people are primarily among scholars known as the global hibakusha. So it's using that Japanese word and extending it beyond its core meaning. And this refers to the people exposed to radiation primarily since 1945, primarily through nuclear tests, nuclear production, Hanford, for example, and nuclear accidents, along with medical experiments and some other forms of exposures. And what I'm going to talk about today is primarily nuclear testing and nuclear weapons. So here is a map of almost all of the nuclear weapon test sites in the world. You can see that nuclear weapons were tested on every continent except South America and Antarctica, both of which have had radiological accidents, by the way, just not nuclear weapon testing. Um, Now, this map shows you the number of tests by location, major locations, to give you a sense. There have been over 2,000 nuclear weapon detonations since 1945. Tests. We think of the Cold War as a period of time in which nuclear weapons were not used, but statistically, a nuclear weapon detonated every 8.6 days during the Cold War. People lived near these places. The place with the most nuclear detonations on Earth is Nevada in the US, over 900 nuclear detonations in Nevada. primary nuclear test site of the former Soviet Union in Kazakhstan, almost 500 nuclear tests conducted there. Multiple sites out in the Pacific. The French conducted almost 200 tests in French Polynesia. There were tests conducted all around the world. And I have written extensively about the colonial nature of nuclear test site locations, how we choose, how we select who we will irradiate, and how we select who we won't irradiate, and through that select who we will irradiate. This is for all nuclear weapon states. Um, Now, the next thing I want to talk about is nuclear weapon effects. We typically talk about nuclear weapon effects as being three things: blast, heat, and radiation. These are all forms of energy that come out from the detonation of the weapon and radiate outward. Now, with radiation, I put an S there because there's two forms of radiation, which originally we called prompt radiation and residual radiation. The difference between prompt radiation and residual radiation is that one is in the form of waves and one is in the form of particles. So they behave differently, and their threats and their risk to us are different. I'll show you what I mean by looking at Hiroshima. At Hiroshima, the weapon was detonated almost 2,000 feet up in the air. So from that detonation point, all of this energy radiates out: blast energy, heat energy, and radioactive waves. There's a burst of waves. So when that burst of radioactive waves happens, it lasted less than a minute. The way to understand that burst of waves is it's like X-rays. When you're going to get an X-ray, you prepare to have the X-ray. Maybe you place your arm on the X-ray plate. The X-ray is turned on. While the X-ray is turned on, radiation is going through your body, creating the image on the plate. The X-ray is turned off. There is now no more radiation present. That's what it's like when the weapon explodes. A gigantic, immense burst of radiation flash like that, but it's radioactive waves and they dissipate and they're gone. Now, if you're inside this area of where those waves went, they pass through your body and they harm you. They harm your body. And all of the damage that is done during those seconds that those waves pass through your body. In Hiroshima, the weapon was detonated downtown. And so we know roughly how much radiation people were exposed to by their distance from downtown, because we know what the energy was. We know the rate at which it dissipated as it went out. So this is one of the reasons that if you ever hear hibakusha testimony, people give their testimony in Hiroshima or in Nagasaki, almost always the first thing they will say is, I was 2.6 kilometers away. I was 1.8 kilometers. They will tell you the exact distance they were, because this is how they understand how much radiation they were exposed to. It's based on a couple of things: distance and shielding. So here, this lists how much radiation people were. So these were the people who were affected by this burst of radiation, roughly out to 3 or 4 kilometers from ground zero in Hiroshima. But that's the waves. Then there are the particles. The particles we typically call fallout, radioactive fallout. Now, in Hiroshima, here, this is the city center here. So the city center was attacked here. The mushroom cloud rises up into the air, and then the mushroom cloud drifts. And in Hiroshima, it drifted to the northwest. And these particles all begin to fall out. And in Hiroshima, because the entire city was burning and there was so much soot in the air, it rained, and the rain carried the soot and the fallout down, and it was called black rain because the soot stained things with black from the oils from the fire, from the smoke. Now, this map shows you the area where the black rain fell to the northwest of Hiroshima. Slowly, we realized that there were people who came into the city the next day to help, to search for family members or to help in any way, but also people that were 20 kilometers away, that were nowhere near the city, not affected by any of those weapon effects, began to get sick. began to get radiogenic illnesses. This was because of the fallout. So it's separate the way these risks work. So just to give you an overview, radioactive waves are what we call external exposures to radiation. The radiation is outside of our body. It passes through our body. The damage is done while it passes through our body. Particles result in what we call internalized radiation. They're primarily dangerous if we get them inside of our body. If I had, for example, on this piece of paper here, say a dozen radioactive particles, there's very little danger to me at this distance because they're giving off a very tiny amount of radiation, these tiny, tiny particles. But if I get it inside of my body and it deposits inside of my body, it will give off this radioactive energy. It will radiate this energy at the cells surrounding it 24 hours a day for as long as the particle remains in your body. We may pass the particle, we may retain the particle. Many particles remain active longer than a human lifespan, so it could be in there the rest of your life, irradiating different parts of your body. Depending on the chemistry of the particle, it gets put into different parts of the body. The body looks at these particles as chemicals. They are chemicals. So, for example, strontium-90, which was widely distributed through nuclear testing, strontium-90 is chemically similar to calcium. So if we get a particle inside our body says calcium, and it puts it in the bones or the teeth. And so this shows you where certain particular fallout particles are typically placed. As we all know, and certainly for people dealing with Hanford, radioiodine is typically placed into the thyroid gland. And this is how we have the thyroid cancers that resulted up in Hanford. So these are different risks. Now I want to talk a little bit about how this ended up affecting people. But here, just so that you see, this is in a cloud chamber where you can see the energy being given off by radioactive material. So this is energy radiating from, this is one of the things you get, it's called uranitite, that you get when mining uranium. But you can see the energy radiating off of this. Now, if you had some particle of this in your thyroid, if you had some particle of this inside your body, it will just be eroding and decaying the cells around it. And this typically will result in cancers, immune disorders, various other radiogenic diseases. And just to give you a sense too of where this comes from, this is a short video of a nuclear test in Nevada. This is, by today's standards, a small nuclear weapon, but you can see as the fireball rises, you can see this column of material being sucked up into the cloud. This is material being brought up. You see the cloud mushrooming it out. Clouds mushroom out because they're filling with particles. That's what's happening is all of this material is being raised into the sky, all of these particles. These fission particles, radioactive fallout particles, there's a range of things that they are. Some of them are particles that are created by the detonation. Some of them are some of the fuel for the explosion, like plutonium that didn't fission and remained plutonium. Some of it is material that is ionized in the process of the detonation. But what you have right here is a whole lot of radioactive particles up in the sky, and they're not going to stay there. Fallout clouds drift, and as they do, the fallout returns down to Earth. So here on the right, we see another nuclear test in Nevada. We see the fallout cloud, but this is about an hour after the test. You can see how dark it is. It is dense with particulates. It is on its way across southern Nevada and into southern Utah, where most of this material will come down. Now, to show you the scale that this can reach, I want to talk about the Bravo test. This was the United States' first deliverable hydrogen bomb test in 1954 at Bikini Atoll. This is a photograph of the detonation taken from 70 miles away from an airplane. It was an immense, gigantic, it was 1,000 times more powerful than the weapon used in the nuclear attack on Hiroshima. But outside of this force, what is astonishing about the Bravo test was its fallout cloud. This is the fallout cloud about 16 minutes afterwards. Now, this fallout cloud spread across the central Pacific. This was a map made by the United States military of the fallout cloud about 4 days later. You can see it had engulfed several atolls. These are populated atolls. Um, so, for example, here at Rongelap Atoll, the day of the test, radiation monitors came to Rongelap Atoll and measured the background radiation levels. They were so high that they panicked and got on their boats and left. 2 days later, U.S. Navy boats came to these atolls, told all of the people there that they needed to be evacuated for their own safety for a few weeks to gather whatever they needed to. And so people gathered what they needed for an hour and they were evacuated, and they still cannot return to live permanently in their homes and on those atolls today, some 70 years later. Here is where the Daigo Fukuyomoru, the Lucky Dragon fishing boat was. This is a boat that was coated with fallout. This boat made it back to Japan, and it was the fact that this boat made it back to Japan and the entire crew was hospitalized with radiation sickness that broke the news of what fallout really is globally. You almost can't find the word fallout in print before 1954, before March 1954. So this is where we learn what fallout can do. By the way, one of the members of the crew of that boat died 6 months later. So here's somebody who is 100 miles away from a hydrogen bomb explosion, and it kills him 6 months later. The US wondered what would happen if this weapon was used on Washington, D.C. And so they made this map. It's the same fallout cloud, but now you have a little sense of scale. What they determined was that if the weapon was used on Washington, D.C., first of all, everyone in Washington, D.C. would be dead because of the blast and the heat and the radioactive waves. But the entire population of Baltimore, the entire population of Philadelphia, and 50% of the population of New York City would die unless they evacuated immediately. And they would be killed by fallout. So now, less than 10 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you have a weapon that can kill tens of millions of people. And the way that it kills them is with fallout, not with explosions. Now, just to give you an idea of how this plays out on the ground, in a sense, here's John Kennedy. This is a letter he wrote in 1961 to the Governor's Conference on Civil Defense, and he warns governors preparing for civil defense, radioactive fallout extending downwind for as much as several hundred miles could account for the major part of the casualties, which might result from a thermonuclear attack on an unprotected population. So he's talking about the Bravo cloud, something like that. This is what could happen. Yet, Kennedy approved 96 nuclear weapon tests for the following year. That
Wow.
averages a U.S. nuclear test every 3.8 days in 1962. And if you add Soviet tests in 1962, statistically, there was a test every 2 days in 1962. Well, on the one hand, he's saying, watch out for this. But remember, he is also the commander of forces, and he's also well aware that this is how you kill people. So I want to talk about fallout as a weapon. This was the second test of the Crossroads test series in 1946 in July. This is less than a year after the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is the second underwater test. You can see this mushroom cloud. You've probably seen these photos. It's very unique because the cloud is very low and wide, and that is because it is full of water. It was detonated underwater. It lifted all of this water up, and then all of the water came back down. As a result, none of the fallout distributed downwind in a cloud, and all of it stayed in the lagoon. And all of the boats in the lagoon and all of the U.S. service personnel working, doing assessments after the test were getting very, very radioactive. And eventually the United States had to evacuate 40,000 troops and cancel a planned third test because of how radioactive the fallout had made it, while they understood that this was an opportunity. Here is from the 1947 report on, or I think maybe in 1948, what is 47, report on those tests. Test Baker gave evidence that the detonation of a bomb in a body of water contiguous to a city would vastly enhance its radiation effects by the creation of a base surge whose mist, contaminated with fission products and dispersed by wind over great areas, would have not only an immediately lethal effect, but would establish a long-term hazard through the contamination of structures by the deposition of radiological particles. Of the survivors in contaminated areas, some would be doomed to die of radiation sickness in hours, some in days, others in years. But these areas, irregular in size and shape, as wind and topography might form them, would have no visible boundaries. No survivor could be certain he was not among the doomed, and so added to every terror of the moment, thousands would be stricken with the fear of death and the uncertainty of the time of its arrival. I assure you, this is as accurate a description of the emotional and psychological state of the millions of people who live within 100 miles of nuclear test sites around the world. This is something the people in the Marshall Islands can relate to, the people in French Polynesia, people in Algeria, people in Kazakhstan. This is, I will point out that this is not something that came just after the bomb. But long before the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, many countries were experimenting with radiological warfare, with just using radioactive particles as a weapon. So here, this is from a 1943 research report. A somewhat different use of the radioactive material than using it for a bomb would depend on the fact that extremely small quantities of certain of the radioactive elements appear to be absorbed in the lungs of animals and produce fatal effects after a period of some weeks. The amounts necessary to produce eventual death under such conditions are extraordinarily small. This means that if such materials could be kept in the air in the form of a fine dust or smoke, in concentrations as low as 0.002 of a microgram per liter, inhalation of such atmosphere for 1 hour would be sufficient to establish a lethal concentration. The material would accumulate in the lungs and the individual would eventually die of the radioactive poison. There is no known way in which such a contaminated individual could be successfully treated once thus exposed. I can bring you similar quotes from Russian scientists. This was common. Just as an aside, I'm happy to talk about, but as an aside, this was so well understood that on D-Day, when US troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, there was a special top secret group that landed with the initial wave with Geiger counters because they thought the Germans might have peppered the beach with uranium and that they wanted to be sure if they were walking into a radiological disaster. So basically, this is how nuclear war fighting strategies evolve. The fact that you could kill this many people with fallout, this was not seen as something that happens if you use nuclear weapons. This is a purpose for using nuclear weapons. So, for example, here we have the effects. Hang on. Those effects that I mentioned earlier, blast, heat, and radiation. Now, in US war plans to fight the Soviet Union, nuclear war, in Soviet war plans to fight the United States, in NATO war plans, in Chinese war plans, there's a way that the effects of these weapons are very specifically focused. And this is how it goes. The blast and the heat, those are aimed at the enemy's nuclear weapon infrastructure. The purpose of the detonations is to destroy the enemy's weapons. If you can destroy the enemy's weapons, you win. They can't attack back. So all of that force is targeted, almost a vast amount of the targeting is on the weapons of the enemy. The radiation, that's for the people. The United States was well aware that if it conducted its war plan against the Soviet Union, that the fallout that it had covered the entire landmass of the Soviet Union with would kill the entire population of both Koreas and Japan as well. So nuclear fallout was intended from the beginning as a weapon effect. And so, as we see here, the people of Utaric Atoll encountering the radiation monitors 2 days after the Bravo test, people who would soon tell them that they needed to leave their homes for the rest of their lives, and they would begin a cycle of enduring radiogenic diseases. As they can attest, the Cold War was a limited nuclear war. We can say that the nuclear war didn't happen because it didn't happen to us. If you lived in Kazakhstan, in eastern Kazakhstan, if you lived in the Marshall Islands, if you lived in certain parts of this world, the Cold War, nuclear war happened. These people live in radiologically contaminated places, or they've been forcibly displaced from radiologically contaminated homelands. And this is one of the main focuses uh, of my book. There's multiple other parts of it which I'm happy to get into, but I wanted to just talk right about weapons and fallout. And I would also extend the earlier mentions that there's a documentary film based on this chapter and another chapter of my book that was just completed a few weeks ago by filmmakers in Europe. And Vin will be joining me. There'll be a showing in Eugene on February 11th, but that film should be in wider distribution in the coming months. Um, so thanks. I wanted to leave some time for any questions or comments that people had. So I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot.
So thank you, Bo. If folks have questions, and well, I think we are small enough to unmute yourself or raise your hand. What's the name of the film? There's a question.
Oh, yeah. It's called Silent War, The Shadow of Nuclear Weapons. And it's also one of the few documents that I have seen with extensive interviews with Soviet troops who participated in nuclear tests. Um, there are globally well over 1 million soldiers who participated in tests for various nuclear weapon states. These are people compelled to participate in nuclear weapon tests, often exposed to radiation no with little information and recourse. Yeah, Vin.
Hey, well, thanks for that. So there is a lot of competing theories and strategies of how to stop all this madness. Some think that congressional resolutions may be the trick, although they don't have any real chance of passing right now. I, for one, have really think we should hitch our wagon to the TPNW, and it's probably because of just how involved I've been in it over the years. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on the TPNW or on, a new freeze movement, or where do you think globally we can work on trying to curb some of this?
Um, yeah, thanks. That's needless to say, that's what we're all involved in. Sorry, I'm just putting on my slipper here. It's a little chilly. Um, yeah, I think I have really pretty firmly come to the opinion that the key way to fight against nuclear weapons is to talk about money, because I think it's the key reason we have them. Um, I sometimes like to say that nobody thought we really needed 70,000 nuclear weapons in the US in the Cold War, but a lot of people really made a lot of money selling 70,000 nuclear weapons during the Cold War. Um, As you know, through books like Atomic Audit, the only thing that the United States specifically spent more on than the nuclear weapon program during the Cold War was other defense spending. I think that the United States is now poised, as we know, on schedule for $2 trillion of spending in nuclear infrastructure upgrading. Certainly, it will end up at $3 or $4 trillion by the time it's all spent. And if what I think we need to do is we need to get people to start to understand the word security in its relation to money. $3 trillion of spending on nuclear weaponry is not going to increase the security of any American except the most paranoid nut out there. But that spending on medical care, on secure retirement, on various things like this. People get that that is security. And we need to get people to understand that that a lot of the hardships they are experiencing is because of what wealthy countries are doing with this money. And countries like the UK are a place where this might be able to be pushed forward, where there is no rational reason from a defense perspective, really, that the UK needs to modernize its weapons, which it will need to do too, which it's in the process of doing too. The UK doesn't have the money to do it. And that's where you might be able to get a conversation going about security and about investing in security. But I think that one of the things one of the conclusions that I've come to is that talking about ethics has gotten us nowhere for 80 years. We have been talking about how nuclear weapons are unethical for 80 years, and not only hasn't it achieved that much, we're not even engaged with an enemy who's responding to us. There's nobody telling us, yes, they are ethical. They may say, yes, they are unethical, but we need them for deterrence or whatever. They don't fight with us on that because they're not vulnerable on that. But you start talking about defense spending and nuclear defense spending and start to bring it, and you will get a response because that is where the vulnerability is. And I think that that's what will get rid of it is people. It will be part of a larger movement of people seizing more control over their governments, is really the way I see it happening personally.
Does that include divestment campaigns?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I would say what I would, and I don't know the specifics. I'd heard a little bit. You might know more about this, Vin, but I would say about the TPNW, one of the things that I would say is that I forget the article that addresses test site communities and remediation and compensation. Um, and I heard that there was some movement, but one of the things that I would say is that I would advise the signatories to the TPNW to just start compensating those global hibakusha. Don't use them to force the nuclear weapon states to feel guilty and say, you need to compensate them, you need to compensate them. If we're serious about this, let's compensate them. Let's help clean these places up. Let that shame the nuclear weapon states. So I think that needs to be integrated in. And I've heard that there was some money now being allocated or designed towards that. But I think that I think that the more we talk about how nuclear weapons are unethical, the less they care. I'll add if I can. Sorry, I just in Hiroshima, I heard forever there was this myth in Hiroshima. If the leaders of the nuclear weapon states could come to Hiroshima, could see what happened here, could meet the hibakusha, could hear their stories, then they would understand and they would abolish nuclear weapons. And now this is predicated on the notion that they don't know nuclear weapons are bad, which is, of course, the reason they have them. But I watched when Obama came to Hiroshima how it would affect that narrative. Because not only did Obama bring the nuclear football into the peace park with him, of course, but he was in the midst at that very time of authorizing the modernization of the US nuclear weapons and nuclear delivery programs. And Obama came, Obama saw Hiroshima, Obama met with hibakusha, Obama left, Obama pursued additional nuclear weaponry. He did not go home and reflect on his ethics. But everybody kept saying it in Hiroshima, that if we just get the nuclear weapon leaders here and if they would just see it. And then in the G7, there were three of them there. And we actually got photographs of Biden with the nuclear football in the Peace Park. They're not, they don't have these weapons because they think they're ethical or because they're worried about ethics in any way. It's a way of extracting public money into private hands. It's one of the main things it is. It's a lot of other things too, but it's that very much. Yeah, Louise. Louise, you're muted.
Yeah,
John,
yeah, I was muted.
There we go. Oh, gotcha.
Okay. So I don't remember the details at all. Maybe somebody else does. But I think that there was a Japanese filmmaker who made a film about the effects of radiation and talked about finding it in this country in children's teeth.
Oh,
Do you
yeah,
know
yeah.
about that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's quite famous. That's where Barry Commoner got his start. Um, yeah, it was the St. Louis Teeth Project was what it was called. And it's because of, as I had mentioned, strontium 90, when it's internalized in the body, it tends to end up in the teeth of the bones. So a bunch of physicians in St. Louis directly in the downwind path of the fallout clouds. Um, they started a campaign for kids when their baby teeth fall out to send the tooth in for science. And thousands of kids did, and kids all across the US did. And they were able to then analyze the strontium 90 content of all of these teeth, knowing where the child was located, knowing what the child's age were. And they were able to show a direct correlation between increases of strontium 90 in children's teeth and specific test procedures, numbers, and so forth. So it was one of the first places where we were able to prove,
Mhm.
separate from the government, who had tons of proof of this, separate from the government, that fallout particles were entering into children's bodies and affecting their health.
And this is after 70 years.
No, this was done in the late 50s
No,
and
no,
early
but
60s.
the radiation is coming from the testing that was done in this country.
Some of it is. Um, so for example, in Hiroshima, there's more radioactive particles in the soil in Hiroshima from hydrogen bomb testing than from the direct attack there. Some of that is Soviet testing, some of that is French testing, some of that is US testing. All of that is all mixed together. We can tell some things though. So for example, there was a study published in 2021 um, that that examined 122 honey samples from the east coast of the United States, looking for cesium-137 from Nevada test site tests. We can tell by the decay rate, we can tell how old radiological particles are. Out of 122 samples, the researchers found cesium-137 particles in over 50% of the honey samples. This is in 2021. So this is 70 years later and about 3,000 miles away from where these tests were conducted. And we can still track the material through the ecosystem and through the food supply and know where it came from. There's lots of research that does this kind of work.
We have some questions in the chat I want to call out.
Oh,
Uh,
please. Yeah.
One is I think this is maybe referring to underground testing, maybe in places like Alaska.
Mm.
Um, so wondering if, if an oil field is contaminated with radioactive fallout or radiation, does it like spread to the oil that's later pulled out of the ground?
Yeah, it can. This is the thing, like we called it Project Plowshares in America, swords into plowshares. But the Soviets had a similar. It's a you know it's basically, I forget, terraforming. The idea was in Alaska to make a harbor, to make another Panama Canal, to release gas that's trapped underground and so forth. Every country that did these tests found that they were massive radiological disasters. And so it was never pursued because it was seen fairly quickly that it was impossible to do this without creating unlivable conditions. So, for example, at the Nevada test site, probably one of, if not the most dangerous place on that test site to visitors is the crater from the peaceful nuclear weapon explosion that was aimed towards testing whether you could release gas. So the Sudan crater. And similarly in Kazakhstan, Lake Chagan, which was a lake that was made through a nuclear detonation, remains one of the most radiological places in the Polygon test site in Kazakhstan. So those plans were made and quickly abandoned um, because they were unable to do it without pretty devastating ecological contamination.
Thank you. And then one more from the
Yeah.
chat before we go to the live folks. Um, Clarification. So regarding the radioactive waves and particles, Dan is wondering if it would be fair to say that the waves are waves of particles.
Oh, no, particles give off waves, but there are waves that exist simply as waves, like X-rays. There is radioactive source. The source, you could say in a nuclear detonation, that the source of the waves is the detonation. So that material is the source of the waves. Um, and when you look at things like the Bravo map of how many people would die in areas, that's because of the external radiation from the heavy amounts of fallout. So that's not assuming all those people will internalize the fallout. It's that so much fallout would fall that the small amount of waves that come off of individual particles would be collectively enough to kill people. I don't know if that explains it clearly.
I think so, but yeah, Dan, feel free to type in the chat if you have a follow-up, and maybe we can go to Joanne next.
Okay, yeah, I can go now? Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to give you a little bit of extra information with regard to Louise's question. They
Hmm.
did show that movie at the third meeting of the state's parties.
Hmm.
And I can remember when I watched it there, they had maps showing the extent of the radiation, and that's what they were trying to show. Nobody realized that these were the extent of the radiation, I think, from the Bravo tests that had
Hmm.
reached as far as New York. I
Yeah,
mean,
it circled
they
the world.
reached across the entire
Uh,
United States, even though the test was way in the Pacific. But
Yeah.
that was one thing that was, and the other thing is, what was the other thing I was going to ask? Um, oh yeah, when the for the G20 group, when the uh, I don't know, was the president of Japan was the in charge of the G20 group. He invited, and that was just a couple of years ago, he invited the G20 group to meet in Hiroshima purposely.
Oh,
And so that,
G7.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was the G7 meeting. Yeah. So all those heads of state were there.
Yeah. There were three nuclear heads of state in the Peace Park in Hiroshima.
It was just three.
Three. And two of
Oh, well,
them,
okay. Yes.
France, the UK, and the US, two of them had with them nuclear footballs so they could launch weapons from the park.
So God help us. I was going to ask you a different kind of question though. Did you see any forms of resistance that you felt worked?
I mean, it depends what you mean by work. There's all kinds of forms of resistance. And so a lot of my work is
Well,
in,
somehow or other brought them either brought the numbers down or brought a change in policy or some kind of positive step.
I, yeah, you could say that one of the positive things was that the outrage over radioactive fallout drove the testing underground. That was a really positive step. And that was because of worldwide opposition and outrage over fallout, which at that time was really more connected with genetic mutation. The the scientists leading the charge against stopping atmospheric testing were geneticists in the late 1950s. Um, but but eventually it did drive the testing underground, and that is a successful form of resistance in a sense. There's tons of forms of resistance that are small and local. Certainly, my field work is primarily in nuclear affected communities, like in test site locations or production locations or accident locations, and people have all kinds of means of uh, not simply being subjected to exposure to toxins. But in terms of changing policy, the people of Kazakhstan rose up, and this was at the collapse of the Soviet Union. They got the test sites shut down, and they got their government to return the nuclear weapons to the Soviet Union or to Russia. So there's been some successes. Um, you know, I really do believe that most policy changes are driven by money. I mean, the reduction in weapons was because those weapons were so old they had to be retired. They were going to retire them, so they make a show of it, acting like they're peacemakers, but they simply went down to the number of weapons they could functionally destroy the world multiple times with, and said that that was a giant step forward. And it is a step forward that we reduce weapons, but the logic of the NPT has never been instituted. The idea that the nuclear weapon states need to disarm. They've
Article 7.
basically never done anything that wasn't technologically compelled. They haven't gotten rid of weapons that they didn't have to get rid of.
Yeah.
The main thing that the NPT has done, from my point of view, is spread nuclear power plants around the world.
Thank you.
Yes. R. Richard.
Oh,
R.
can you hear me
Richard.
all right?
Totally.
Robert Richard here. Hey, Yeah, I'm always interested in finding the truth of the real history of the weapons. And I can recall as a youth reading books about Einstein first coming to the country in 1935, getting off the boat and eating his first hot dog.
Yeah.
And then recent years, I found pictures of Einstein in Hollywood with his buddy, uh, the movie actor, at movie things and movie showcases, and what Charlie Chaplin and was one of his
Yeah.
friends and everything. Yada yada yada, and I've found towns in Colorado that used to mine uranium before 1935, and then they covered that all up and buried those towns and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, you bet.
And I'm not a nuclear physicist, but I was in the Navy and I was in nuke
Hmm.
webs and stuff like that for a while. But
Sure.
fission fusion makes no difference to me. But and I've read the account of it was a serviceman that got the bomb to fuse radiologically at 1,800 feet over Hiroshima. He had to fuse it, but he noticed in
Right.
his biography that it had never been tested. But that was like the bomb. That was like Hiroshima had no plutonium in it, right? That was like
Right.
when,
Uranium-235.
yeah, it was just so that was Fermi proved it would work. They were pretty darn sure it was going to work, but it was never tested, right? But
Not the Hiroshima bomb, no.
right, but the one in New Mexico was the same as the one in Nagasaki, right? They had
Exactly. That
plutonium.
the implosion design they tested it because they were uncertain it would work.
And that was Salazar's baby, really, wasn't it? They have to have plutonium for a hydrogen bomb.
That was Edward Teller.
Well,
Um,
tell her, but I've read stories of Salazar and
er,
Oppenheimer and Teller. Yeah, they were saying Salazar wanted to said, yeah, well, we know we can do that thing in Hiroshima, the Hiroshima type, but we could do. He wanted to do a hydrogen bomb, and that's basically what they blew up in New Mexico at the what do you call it? I can't even remember the name of
Trinity.
it. Trinity, yeah, I know it's like a 13-pound chunk of plutonium or something like that. It was horrendous amount of plutonium, but
Do you have a question?
so they really needed a lot of electrical power from that Grand Coulee Dam. So all this that Grand Coulee Dam was created by 1930, and
Robert, could you get to a question?
yeah, so they're covering up about when like somebody before this was mentioning about the PBS show, and they were saying the Germans were ahead. The Germans were ahead by 3 years. Was that really true?
Absolutely not.
Was that ever really true?
No, the Germans were basically at the lab research stage. They never got beyond
Yeah,
the lab research stage. So
I read
they
stories
were
that
nowhere near production. They never
yeah.
tested even basic concepts.
That's all I wanted to. Thanks.
Sure.
That's yeah.
Maybe one more question for you, Bo. If you've spoken with faith communities on this subject, is there anything that you found is helpful to moving them to action on this issue?
To faith communities?
Hmm. Yeah,
Uh,
churches, mosques, etc.
yeah, I think it was certainly, I'll say this, in many global hibakusha communities, specifically test site related communities, often religious institutions have been primary places of resistance and organization. For example, in French Polynesia, a lot of the opposition to French nuclear weapon testing came both from trade unions and from churches. And in the Marshall Islands, certainly it's an incredibly devout society in general. And so since most of my work has been in those places rather than in the nuclear weapon states per se, those are the places where I've seen it. And I've certainly seen the way that faith communities can sustain and empower people, I see that working well in a lot of those global hibakusha sort of communities. And at the same time, for example, that in French Polynesia, that I was told that there's some complicity between the certain churches in the state. So, there's a range. But I know that in the United States and certainly in Europe, a lot of the activism and a lot of the anti-nuclear activism came through faith communities. And I would also say that some of the early ethical questioning in the United States, and by early, I mean August and September of 1945, similar times to the period that Vin works on, part of the work that he's done, was in church publications and church debates about the ethical nature of nuclear weapons. So it's been an engagement from the start. So that's the main way I can answer. That's the sort of communities I've been seeing.
I think that about does it for our time. Bo, thank you so much. Really excellent presentation. I think we all learned a lot. If people want to read your book or reach out to you for questions, where should they go?
Oh, bojacobs.net, or nuclearbodies.com, either of those. And, you can just look up Bo Jacobs and you could find me and reach out. I'm happy to chat about anything. And I am happy, and I'll share with the coalition information about screenings about silent war, as because I'm sure that there'll be something in Seattle or in Portland too at some point. So
And come to our event in Eugene.
yes, and come to our event in Eugene, please do.
Yeah,
We will have a few other scholars there. It'll be a fascinating time.
awesome, awesome. Thank you so much. We are always trying to, answer the question about how do we rebuild the movement? How do we organize locally? And yeah, it's great to have you in the Pacific Northwest as a resource.
Well, I'm really glad to be here and really glad to get connected up with you all. It's a pleasure. And I mentioned to Sean earlier, but I'm unable to stay for the rest of the meeting because I have a family obligation. So I just wanted to mention that to folks. But feel free to reach out. I'm happy to chat or connect people to resources around this. Um, and I also, just to mention, in the last part of that book, I deal quite a bit with high level waste issues, which particularly plagues Washington State and the Northwest.